Hey, folks, welcome back. As I warned you, I have yet another friend of mine on the program. I am really blessed over the years just to get to know so many people, not imagining that sometime in the future they might write a book and I might get to tell the world about it on my radio or TV program. But today, I have to say, I have a dear friend with me as my guest, Michael Wilkerson, no relation to David Wilkerson, my former pastor. Mike Wilkerson is a strategic advisor. He was a managing director at Lazar Frere. Some of you, that might mean something to you. He's an investor. He's a former CEO of Fairfax Africa. But right now, I know him in this new capacity as an author, as someone who writes about American history, about current events. And I'm just thrilled to have him with me in the studio to talk about his brand new book, Why America Matters. Mike Wilkerson, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to be here with you.
It is amazing, as years pass and your friends, go through their careers and things. And only recently have you morphed from this investment guy, this financial guy that I've known for so long, into somebody who writes in many places about what's going on in the country today. And if you would, share a little bit of that journey before we get to the book, because the book titled Why America Matters is it ends up being sort of a summation of what you have learned on this journey from, investment guy to author, who's still an investment guy, but who's writing big books.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Let me back up and just describe a little bit of the trajectory. So I started my career on Wall Street as a merger and acquisition advisor for Lazard, as you mentioned. Spent over a dozen years advising large companies on complex cross-border transactions. And over the next decade, during the last decade, between 2012 and lockdowns in 2020, was running an investment company focused on investing in quality businesses in Africa around a thesis of food security, energy security. We were investing in financial services companies, agribusiness companies. And during that entire time, I was very focused on what was going on in Africa in terms of politically, socially, big transformations happening all across the continent. But I think in fairness, I had lost track of what was happening in my own country here in the US, here in America. And as everyone who is here with us today will know, in 2020, life as we knew it came to an abrupt halt. When lockdowns came in March 2020, travel restrictions came. The life that I'd been living for a decade or more, which involved a lot of international travel, bouncing around from place to place, came to an absolute halt. And when it did, my attention turned back, as it did for all of us, to what in the world is going on around us. Like, these seem like very strange things that are happening. The word unprecedented was overused, but it certainly was unexperienced by anyone in our generation to see something like this. And so during that time, during 2020, early on in the lockdown, someone said to me, if you're not picking up a new hobby, you're doing something wrong. And for me, that was to begin to write publicly about some of the things that I saw going on. It was something that I'd always wanted to do, had been too busy with work, had a moment in time where not only did I have the time to do it, but I had, I would say, a burning interest in trying even to understand for myself and articulate what is happening? What is this thing?
Well, you and I are both men of faith. I know you from way back. There were not many serious Christians in Manhattan. 20-something years ago, you were on the board of my daughter's school, Christian school, here in New York City. So I think anybody who's a serious person of faith, when the lockdowns happened, you just said, this smells really weird. This doesn't feel, it just doesn't feel good. It feels like something is happening. And so you and many others were trying to process this. I was one of them, obviously, but you pretty quickly transitioned to writing about it and writing quite a bit.
I did. So one of the things that happened to me personally was I started to I needed to do my own research. I needed to understand. I was being told one thing on a media headline, And there's something about it, and this happened over and over again, that just didn't feel right. And so I would go to the source. I'd go look at the original transcript of a speech, go look at the original video of something that happened. And it started to dawn on me for the first time in my life that fake news was real. Now, many, yourselves and others, had come to this awareness long before, so I was late to the party. But as soon as I did, it was a wake-up call that I felt compelled to point it out, that this stuff was happening, that something was being said that didn't comport with reality, didn't comport with the facts. And I started to do it around things that I knew best, which was around the markets, the economy, finance, things that were going on. I started to write in 2000 in the summer about a looming inflationary crisis. And at that point, that was fringe. I was already immediately discounted by a lot of my, call it Wall Street peers, because that didn't happen. We lived in a deflationary period for 3 decades, 30 years. And so, but I could see it, that we were creating a scenario where this was a likely outcome. And like you, as a student of history, I know that there are patterns that can be seen over time. The problem for most of us is we only have lived a half a century, plus or minus, which isn't long enough to really understand what's going on. So to answer your question, I think I started to write because I was increasingly concerned that the wool was being pulled over our collective eyes on that issue and on a number of others.
And I want to say, to my audience, folks listening here, it is not easy to face the horror of what's going on. It took me quite some time to understand, because we talk about fake news, we talk about these things. I have seen, the moment I was born again and accepted Jesus, I understood I now live in a world that's crazy, because that world pretends Jesus is not Lord, there is no God. They actually pretend as though that's okay, as though saying that, I think math is stupid and I'm going to live my life without math or science or what, And I thought to myself, so once you accept that you're living in a crazy world, in a fallen, broken world that doesn't embrace truth or the one who is truth, now you have to figure out, where are we on the spectrum, right? And so I start noticing, okay, we have secular bias. We have left-wing bias in the New York Times. So for years, I'm watching this. But it got worse and worse and worse. And when Trump became president, I had never seen anything like it. I said the left-wing New York Times went crazy. The left-wing CNN has gone crazy. These folks are now committed to a cause that has nothing to do with truth or journalistic standards. So, but I want to say, to accept that is not easy. It's like suddenly you're living in a new world, and none of us wants to live in that world. But it kept going, and you just said, when 2020 hits and we have lockdowns and we're hearing things, I think, I'm saying this, Mike, just because I know there are people who are still having a hard time processing that these things have happened in America.
One of the things that happened to me at the time was I have 2 then late teenage boys, and we would have dinner together. And they would bring up an event that had happened that day, something on the news, a social unrest, a Black Lives Matter riot, as they turned out to be, or otherwise. And they took very different perspectives on this. One tended to be very sympathetic on a basis of just justice and fairness. The other, who had been at a military school, very much backed law enforcement, thought, defund the police, that sounds terrible. And we would have these debates. And what I realized is that I wasn't smart enough about what was going on. I needed to get smarter. But that part of it was being able to make sure that, because they both had their own version of fake narratives, and yet to be able to articulate the truth. And it led me to I started writing, as I mentioned, op-eds and things like this, but all of a sudden I realized I had so much to say so quickly that to finally answer your question, I wrote my first book, Stormwall: Observations on America in Peril, about the madness of 2020. The idea of that book was that look at these 4 different waves that are happening to us: the pandemic, social unrest domestically, economic issues, especially looming inflation, and finally the rising challenge with China and all the things that had gone on around it. I basically said that each of these individual waves are severe enough, but they're coming together in what physicists call constructive amplitude. They come together in a perfect match, they mount, and it creates this giant tsunami of events. Lo and behold, as I wrote, this is happening as we're about to enter the most controversial election in American history, at least since the mid-19th century. So that was a lot of the motivation initially to really to answer the question that you just asked, to say how is it Americans are looking at and thinking about these issues.
Let me just say, we're going to go to break. Folks, you can find out about Michael Wilkerson's first book, Stormwall. You can go to stormwall.com, Michael Wilkerson. When we come back, we're going to talk about his new book, which is out today. It is called Why America Matters, and it is, according to me, an astonishing achievement. We'll be right back. Folks, welcome back. I'm talking to my friend Michael Wilkerson. He is a strategic advisor and investor, now an author of 2 books. The first book, Stormwall, you can find at stormwall.com. But the brand new book, which is out today, is called Why America Matters. And I have a number of friends that write books, and they ask me if I can give them an endorsement or something like that. And it's very tough because I don't have time. But I managed to read all, I think it was 400 pages of Why America Matters, because it's so good, it's so compelling. And when I was finished reading it, the blurb, the endorsement that I gave is, Why America Matters by Michael Wilkerson is an astonishing achievement. Wilkerson's masterful synthesis of our history as it relates to where we are right at this moment and how we can and must go forward is an inestimable gift and can hardly be praised enough. Mike, your book, Why America Matters, the reason it's amazing is there are at least 2 reasons, but one is you get right to the heart of this question. It's the ultimate question, why America matters. Let's try to figure out who we are, whether we matter, and if we matter, why we matter. But in order to do that, you really do, as I put it, you do this masterful synthesis of our history. You take us through our history in a way that is valuable, at least because most Americans have forgotten. Most of us either were never taught in school or we've kind of accepted the narrative of the last 40 or so years, which pretty much ignores this history. That's what I find fascinating, is that if you don't know this history, you are really ripe for deception. But so in the book, you choose to tell that history on your way to getting to where we are now and how it matters. So I don't know where you want to start, but
well, let me just maybe address the question of why I did that. I think you said you described 2 types of Americans. One is people who have forgotten their history. So perhaps of our generation, been around for a long time during a period of time that has been laden with cynicism about the meaning of America, about whether America was special.
That's right.
About whether there was anything of value in our national patrimony. And even if we grew up in an environment that still said the Pledge of Allegiance, still taught American history, still taught civics, that foundation has been eroded and eroding away for an entire generation. So I'm 50-some years old. I remember getting those kinds of instructions, but I also remember what life was like in graduate schools at elite liberal arts colleges and the intentional undermining of
well, look,
those
you
messages.
and I have lived through this because we're old enough to remember when America was still vaguely patriotic and when these basics were taken for granted, and when the older generation certainly loved the country and many of them had fought for the country. But you and I had the fortune and misfortune of going into these elite institutions where we pretty much picked up there's another narrative, there's an anti-American narrative, and the cultural elites today almost universally have adopted that narrative. And as a result of that, several decades worth of Americans have not been getting the memo that America is special, that America matters.
That's exactly right. And the second group that you described were those who have never learned it. So for a younger generation, we call them Gen Z, who that age group, that cohort, have probably never had even the foundational experience that our generation might have had, at least getting the basics down. And we're facing a time when an entire generation doesn't know its own history, doesn't understand the meaning of America, have lived with the narrative that you just described, what I would say is a false narrative about America's meaning and its history. And you see it when you look at their beliefs. So you look at all the polls, they no longer really believe in democracy. They see it as one choice among many. Maybe socialism's great, maybe communism's great, maybe being run by a technocratic elite is just fine. They really don't appreciate the value. And Why America Matters was written for those two groups, to help remind and to perhaps instruct for the very first time, just for someone to say, wow, I never knew that this was true about this place we call home.
Well, it's an astonishing thing to realize that, I mean, I think everybody says this, you get older, time kind of speeds up, and you really can't help but live in the past, because it seems like 5 minutes ago, we were kids and we lived in this kind of America, and it's hard to believe how far America has drifted. And so waking up during the pandemic, you suddenly look around and you think, wow, I see a lot of the earmarks of Marxism. I see communist-style state control of the people. In other words, the kind of thing that would have been antithetical to any generation before suddenly became possible, and a lot of people who, I mentioned before that accepting that there are these elites trying to manipulate you, that's not easy. I can understand why people would drag their feet and saying, well, it's overblown, come on, because it's too painful to think that there are people like blue state governors putting COVID patients in nursing homes, that they would be that cavalier about life. It just never happened in America, or at least not in our America. So when it does happen, it takes some time to kind of recalibrate. And I think that's what your book helps us do.
You have written in many books around issues like this, Bonhoeffer being the most notable example of how an entire culture can be subsumed with a false ideology, a political ideology that actually supplants the real values of the nation. America was special in one way because it had seen forms of tyranny, forms of oppression. It had seen them in the pre-colonial era and coming out of England, looking for a place for religious and civic freedom.
Forgive me, this is a very terrible interruption because this is radio. We're going to cut you off mid-sentence. We will be back with the rest of that sentence and Mike Wilkerson. The book is Why America Matters. Folks, welcome back. Talking to Michael Wilkerson. His new book is Why America Matters. And Michael, I just cut you off in the break there. You were talking about American history.
You reminded me
that.
You made a comment that described how Americans have experienced, let's say in the last decade, an increasing degree of what feels like totalitarianism. Surveillance from government, surveillance from corporations, various forms of tyranny. And I was beginning to make a comment that America was birthed in a less technologically sophisticated rejection of tyranny. So pre-colonial period, the Puritans and others left England in order to find religious freedom, civic freedom, to create a different kind of government that hadn't existed before. Contemporaneous with our American Revolution, the French Revolution was going on, but it became extremely autocratic, extremely controlled, extremely tyrannical. And something unique happened in America at that time that allowed this nation to go in a different direction than where the French Revolution went. You've written about 20th century variations of this with Bonhoeffer and otherwise, where in Europe, in authoritarian movements, whether labeled communism or fascism or otherwise, a more modern manifestation of this. And America's been largely free of that for its 3 centuries of history. We're now at a period where those same forces, in disguise, are taking root in our own nation, in our own country. And it's coming in ways that are more or less obvious, but from points of origin that one would not have expected. It isn't just a fascist leader who's taking control of the police state, although there are elements of concern now in our national security apparatus, in our intelligence apparatus, in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or federalized police force, that give rise to the same kind of concerns. It's also happening in the private sector in a way that hasn't been seen before. Prior to this technological revolution, it was not possible for a small group of very large, very powerful companies, more powerful than most nation states, to be able to influence what we hear, what we see, and what we think. And this is where it's very subtle and very dangerous, because this indoctrination is going on day after day after day. And when you're able to step away from it through perspectives that you provide or others provide, it's only then when you can start to see the forest for the trees and realize, hold on, this looks awfully familiar to a student of history, to somebody who's seen these patterns before in new garb. In modern garb.
That's what's so interesting to me, is that people always, expect things to happen in the same way, right? Like, oh, we're going to get a fascist dictator. Oh, it's Trump. He's, Hitler 2.0. Simple. No, it's often dramatically different. What you just said, I mean, who could have foreseen social media, big tech? Who could have foreseen that corporate America would get woke and be effectively, pro-diversity, quote unquote, that they would have swallowed that pill of madness, and that would come into corporate America. So we see a kind of collection of bizarre, unprecedented things working together, and it really isn't easy to step back and to see it. Although sometimes it's clear, like when you make the point between there's the French Revolution and the American Revolution, when you really understand how dramatically different those revolutions were from where they were coming from and where they ended. When you understand what happened in Nazi Germany, you have, in a sense, a vocabulary to process this. But a lot of people haven't been processing it, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on, because it's just, I'll say it again, it's simply not easy to swallow this. This is an amazing thing that we're going through.
Yeah. One of the things that made that transition unique in America is that at the time, the French Revolution, for example, the Enlightenment movement that represented the revolutionary France was completely anti-religious. It was a secular movement. They wanted to erase the infamy of the church. They wanted to basically destroy an entire civilization's legacy. Something different happened in America, which was because of our pre-colonial history. The Enlightenment embraced the church, and the church embraced Enlightenment. And I argue, as others do, that the only way that the American experiment could have happened was by that successful integration of the virtues of the Enlightenment around knowledge, around political thinking that arose out of it, around separation of powers, around the rights of the citizens were the actual rulers of the country. Novel idea. That was actually embraced alongside a very unique American theology that believed that God had a special place in his heart for America, that there was something new, a new experiment that God was undertaking for a purpose that was intended as a blessing to America, but more importantly, or equally as a blessing to the world, that the role that this country would play would resonate as it has over time.
Well, that's what's so interesting, is that I wrote a book called If You Can Keep It. And one of the big takeaways for me as I was processing this, and thanks to Oz Guinness, to try to understand what America is. And so the title of your book is Why America Matters. And part of the answer why America matters is because America is unique and exceptional in that it doesn't only exist for itself. There's something really wild about that, and there's something profoundly biblical about that. A nation that exists for others, a nation that cares about other nations, a nation that cares about transcendent ideas like liberty, not just being an American, but what does it mean to be an American? What are these concepts of liberty? These are universal concepts. And so when Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, it's amazing because it is universal. So we're talking about this thing called truth, and there hadn't been nations before that were wrestling with what is truth. And so there is something beautiful about America, and that's been largely lost in the last decades, and we're talking about that. And you're talking also about another unprecedented thing. Of course, Tocqueville, couldn't believe, like he thought, my goodness, liberty is always at war with the church, but in America, which is what you just said, bizarrely, amazingly, they're actually bolstering each other. because we don't have an established church. The church is not a powerful organization like the monarchy. It's
Right.
kind of this free thing. So we're going to continue to explore this with Michael Wilkerson. The new book, superb book, it's called Why America Matters. We'll be right back. Hey there, folks. We're talking with the author of a new book, Why America Matters. And Michael, there's a lot to talk about here, but we're kind of reprising the history of America. And you were touching on this idea, which is so utterly important, of how in America we sort of took the best of the Enlightenment. We didn't take the hyper-secular atheistic part of it, which of course is false, the way France did. So we took the good part of the Enlightenment and wedded it to these new ideas of freedom, and we created this nation that, I mean, if anybody wants, it's sort of funny when people celebrate Bastille Day. I think, do they even know, like what a mess.
Right.
What an absolute, a bloodbath and a mess. The French Revolution is just the most bizarre, checkered way, to begin anything. And I think we could argue that it totally didn't succeed. I mean, it's kind of weird because they act like, oh, it was a good thing and we believe in these values. But how did that go? It led to Napoleon.
Not well.
It led to whatever. I mean, it did not lead to anything comparable to what our revolution led to, because those kinds of revolutions simply, by definition, cannot.
You said something earlier, the famous quote of, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The interesting thing is they were hardly self-evident at the time. The idea of equality, that all men were created equal, was novel in history. No civilization really had practiced that. There were always classes, there were always castes. That Enlightenment idea succeeded in the U.S., in America, I would argue, because of the Christian foundation that went alongside of it. It's often been said that the Founding Fathers, may not necessarily have been Christians the way we understood them, but they were steeped like a tea in a long cultural history of the importance of religion in America, and the idea that virtue was necessary for a republic to survive. And so it was a very different foundation. You mentioned Tocqueville. By the time he started writing about America in the 1830s, 1840s, a real narrative of who America was had begun to coalesce. It was a time when history was the most important category of books, that American history was becoming extremely popular, and a lot of it was about, for the first time, laying out the foundations of who are we as a people? Where did we come from? What is our destiny? And of course, right in the middle of a terrible conflict, which was the unresolved issue of slavery that the Founding Fathers were not able to or willing to address at the time of the Constitution and the foundations of the country, which unfortunately then echoed as a contradiction to the founding ideals of the country that unfortunately ultimately tore the country apart in order to resolve it, and even then not perfectly.
Well, and of course is still tearing the country apart. I mean, it's so fascinating to look back. And let's be honest, many of the founders despised slavery. I mean, the idea that they were okay with it is a joke. They despised it, and it was sickening to them that they had to make this evil compromise. It was clearly sickening to them, but they didn't know any way forward but to do that. And of course, it resolves itself as bloodily as can be, with 600,000 men dying. Not to say how many wounded. Just, again, we're living through these kind of the woke madness of our day that forgets that 600,000 men died in a war over this issue. It would have been very easy for Lincoln and company to kind of let it ride, like, who cares? We'll just keep going and we'll figure it out as we go along. But it came to this bloody clash because Lincoln was obviously really, to my mind, kind of a prophet. He was. We're out of time. When we come back, we're just going to continue the wonderful conversation, at least I think it's wonderful, with the author of Why America Matters, Michael Wilkerson. Don't go away. Ding, ding, ding. We enter hour 2 in my conversation with my friend Michael Wilkerson. The book, really an amazing book. It's called Why America matters. Okay, so Michael, we left off talking about the issue of slavery, and you write really extensively about that battle in our history, because a lot of times we get the short version of it.
To me, this was the foundational challenge. This was the question that was going to define who would we become as a nation. Slavery was an aberration. It was inimical to the ideals articulated in the Declaration, in the Constitution, and yet we allowed it to live. There was a belief that, it'll just go away on its own. Later following the signing of the Declaration, a lot of the signatories and others really began to rally around resistance to the idea of slavery. But we were in conflict because half of the nation in the South were very much wedded to it from their economic and cultural, social life. John Quincy Adams, after he left the White House, spent the next 3 decades in the House of Representatives haranguing about the issue of slavery. Benjamin Franklin, in his last decade, really devoted himself to abolitionist causes. The rise of the abolitionist movements in the 1830s through 50s, 60s really were a catalyst to begin to awaken public consciousness at a broader level to the evil that was the institution of slavery. The most fascinating person that I found in this whole period of history was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who in his youth had taught himself to read, got all kinds of books whenever he could, eventually escaped to the North, and long story short, became a leading abolitionist, a leading voice, a friend of President Lincoln, and in my view, was the most prophetic voice speaking to the conscience of America, saying, this thing is evil and it has to be destroyed. And the only way it's going to be destroyed is through the fires of the war. And the interesting thing about Frederick Douglass that I think is relevant, one of the things for our time, is he was very clear that patriotism requires the citizen to stand up and challenge its country when it goes off track. That it is not possible for someone, a lover of their country, to sit back and watch the forces of dissolution and destruction tear apart what matters. And it challenged audiences at the time, because he was speaking to largely white, elite members of society saying, you must act. You can no longer sit here. And of course they did act. And you mentioned before the break, the millions of lives that were lost in the war, that Northern Union lives that were lost to try to break apart this wretched evil. What scares me is that there are polls out there today that show that only a minority of Americans believe that the Civil War was over the issue of slavery. The most common answer is the propaganda one, which is it was about states' rights and sort of our right to choose what we wanted to do. No, Frederick Douglass himself said the mission of the war, the purpose of the war, is slavery above all else. Yes, it encompasses all these other objectives like holding the Union together, but it was about creating an America that represented the American ideal that had been created at the time of the founding and set up long before. Did it work? No. We went through the war, Reconstruction. General then President Grant was a leading advocate of Reconstruction. The Department of Justice actually was originally established to go after the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which was a militarized arm of the Democratic Party at the time. Fascinating that we've gone so far in our history.
Was the KKK funded by George Soros? I'm just asking. I pretty much we would assume that, but I don't know.
Only indirectly.
I don't know if he's that old.
Shadow organizations.
If he's that old. But it's a fascinating thing because part of I think the reason sometimes people say, like, oh, Eric, you're really humble. It's like, no, I'm actually honest when I say that 10 minutes ago I didn't know things that I'm really embarrassed. When I think about Dinesh D'Souza has written in depth about how the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. It was the party of racism, the party of Jim Crow. And this is going into our lifetimes when you've got, Dixiecrats like Byrd, the head of the Senate. And I have to say, I'm ashamed that I didn't really understand that history, that I swallowed the false narrative of our time, that the Democratic Party is for the common man and for black Americans. And you think, no, like 10 minutes ago, they kind of flipped the narrative. Yeah. But the history is incredibly gruesome. So when you read about the KKK, you read about the Republican Party being founded with Lincoln, that history has not been taught, basically, and it's pretty ugly.
This has to be the biggest political sleight of hand in history, to erase the history of the Democratic Party, to invent something new. Going back to the point you made, so the party was split before the war, with a lot of people leaving from the North who just could not brook the continuation of slavery. During the Civil War and after, the Democratic Party became the party of the slaveholding South, of the slave power, trying to get federal troops out of the South, trying to reimpose the black codes, keeping black Americans away from the voting booths. It moved, as you said, through a period where they were really quite effective to reestablish segregation, reestablish the Jim Crow laws. You move into the 20th century, and somehow, when I said a sleight of hand, somehow it was the trick that the Democratic Party became largely the party of blacks and other minorities, notwithstanding its own history and notwithstanding the fact that even today, the programs that are advocated by the Democratic Party ostensibly on behalf of blacks and other minorities are the very things that are destroying their cultures, their families,
now,
their societies.
I just want to say, folks, this is, it gets a little complicated, but this goes way back. In 1965, one of the heroes, the intellectually honest members of the Democratic Party, Senator Moynihan, wrote extensively about how the breakdown of family was destroying black communities. He dared to say that in 1965. In other words, that issue was at the heart of everything, and he was shut down. It was kind of like, well, no, that's considered racist. Even though he was very liberal, he was honest about talking about some of these policies, big government policies, these kinds of things are destroying black communities. And so we've been living with that ever since. That, Dr. King, of course, was openly Christian in what he was writing about and what he's advocating for. But there's this other side of black activism, whether it's Malcolm X going into Al Sharpton and the radical left that we see today, but they are advocating policies, we need to be clear, that are harmful to black Americans. And so just because I'm white doesn't prevent me from saying that. If I love my black brothers and sisters, I'm going to say those policies are wicked. And so there's always been this kind of battle in a way. And I would like to think that today a lot of black Americans are kind of waking up to this. They've been taken for granted. They've been targeted by Planned Parenthood. That's getting into some much more recent stuff. But keep going on Frederick Douglass.
Well,
Forgive
one
me.
of the things I was going to say is that in the book, I move away from the history of events like the wars and foundational events like the Revolutionary War, the signing of the Constitution. I move into the what I call the ideological attack that occurred really beginning in the 60s. And I think that that's very foundational what's going on right now, because at the same time, one of the things that Frederick Douglass himself pointed out was he articulated very clearly that the institutions of the slave power, including the slave trade, including what was going on interstate, was affecting black slaves and the white poor equally. So Irish immigrants coming across, getting impressed to work in the shipyards and other things, basically slave conditions, not nearly as bad as being an African-American, black American in the South. But nonetheless, Frederick Douglass was the first one to say, this is not about race. This is about class. This is about an elite cabal trying to keep down certain parts of society. And those two, the black slave and the poor immigrant, white immigrant, have more in common with each other than they do with their so-called racial brothers or sisters.
Okay, I am talking to the author of Why America Matters. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm talking to the author of a new book, Why America Matters, Michael Wilkerson. So you really cover so much in the book, Michael, but where do we want to go from here?
I think I just wanted to go to a good portion of the book is talking about what I call the ideological attack. I mentioned this right before the break, that something fundamentally shifted in around the beginning of the 1960s, that over the course of our lifetimes, our generation, that the battle moved into the very foundational ideas of what is truth. What is real and what is not. So with the rise of postmodernism, this idea that there was no truth, that words didn't have any specific meaning, they could mean whatever they wanted.
Okay, now we're talking about the 20th century.
20th century. So I'm moving ahead here, unless we want to be here for 3 days.
No. Well, I mean, I just love the history lesson and I love the discussion. But in your book, you do really beautifully move through the decades and help us understand kind of how we got here. So in the 20th century, this new idea comes in. And again, there are no new ideas. It's just the new version or the new manifestation of it. But yeah, this war on truth, which if you don't believe in truth, it's really hard to believe in transcendent values, in the dignity of the human being. And so the deconstruction critical theory really undermines everything that makes liberty and freedom possible. I mean, liberty and truth possible.
You know, I think in the 60s and the 70s, even in the 80s, postmodernism was in a corner of academia. It was seen as, okay, there it is. I don't think we've appreciated how pervasive it's become, how much it has leaked out into society as a whole. And what is it? What are we talking about? Well, it's the idea that there is no truth, that you can't make any judgment on absolute sense. It really is subjective as to the meaning. And the way this manifests is in power and language, in a view in that world, that power, you can understand everything by looking at the power structure, who's in charge, and that's how identity politics really comes up with this ideas of intersectionality and being able to look at somebody based on an oppressor-victim construct. But it also comes down to language. And one of the things that this ideological attack is doing is systematically undermining for all of us the meaning of words, the meaning of patriotism. It's no longer a virtue. It's a bad thing to be a patriot. The meaning of truth, the meaning of family, the meaning of men,
and let me
women.
cut to the chase just to sum up. This is satanic. I can say that. The distinguished author doesn't need to say that, but it's satanic. You are undermining everything, and you're making it possible for evil to triumph, but it's with such a level of sophistry that it's done. I mean, you were just saying it. I was at Yale in the 80s when you had the deconstructionists,
Yes.
Jacques Derrida came to visit, and you have and this is all this academic, I mean, most people know it's just baloney. They're blowing smoke, but it's so pernicious. And that acid worked its way through the decades until you get suddenly to where we are now. It's the long march through the institutions. That's the cultural Marxism of Gramsci and the Frankfurt School. And they basically took these really evil ideas and worked them through so that suddenly you think, how did we get here? Well, they've been working on it.
What's shifted from that time? I followed in the same institution a few years after
Yes,
you,
you
and
did.
at least at the time, there was a fair fight. In other words, there were the reactionaries, the conservatives who were saying, no, there is such a thing as truth. There is a reality that is objective, that's outside of ourselves. And there was a healthy debate. Today, that is no longer true.
Right.
There's no public square anymore in our universities where the other side of the view can speak truth without being canceled, without being expelled, without being compromised.
I mean, I just want to say, so when I was at Yale, Harold Bloom, you could never consider him a conservative or any kind of a Christian at all, but he was sickened kind of viscerally by what he called the grievance industry, that it was basically, he just knew that it was wrong. And but he was not coming from some conservative position. He was coming from an old liberal position. I was recently in Las Vegas where I had the privilege of interviewing John Cleese of Monty Python fame. He, like a lot of old school comedians and geniuses, they're sickened by the cancel culture, that I can't bring up this or this or this. And in the conversation with him, he was saying, it's the French, isn't it? It was kind of funny because it's like kind of a Python skit. But yes, Derrida and Foucault and others have brought these wicked ideas in. And so old school people like John Cleese, who's an atheist, he's a liberal, he's a Trump hater, but he understands that this cancel culture comes out of these philosophies. And I think a lot of comedians kind of get this because they're all about speaking truth, saying the uncomfortable thing.
Yeah.
And the older comedians are saying, well, I can't, Jerry Seinfeld, even 10 years ago, said, I'm not going to colleges anymore. It's sickening. I crack a joke and I get attacked. So it's kind of interesting to see that some people who we wouldn't think of as on our team politically or theologically, but they have this visceral sense there's a thing called liberty. I like it. It's beautiful. Those are like what we would call the old liberals. They are not the woke liberals.
Yeah. So one of the things I do is make a distinction between the old school liberals and new, more radicalized progressives, what we would call the woke today. What's so strange is that today's populist conservative movement has more in common with the old liberal than with the new progressives. What do I mean by that? The old liberals were concerned about individual freedom, privacy, the right to just be left alone. These are issues that are now coming full circle, and it's now conservatives that are concerned about the power of the police state, about the power of surveillance. Where the progressive left, the radicalized woke left, follows a set of understandings. I write in the book that the politics of grievance are never satisfied. The idea you mentioned, this grievance industry, the irony that at a time where it's never been better for minorities in America, blacks or others, not perfect, obviously, but never been better in terms of equality, wages between men and women, between the races than today, is the same time at which this battle flag of BLM has been raised. It's hurting the black communities because it's, first of all, it's a lie, but it's also undermining their ability to thrive. Perpetual victimhood is no means for thriving in life.
But we also have to be clear that this concept of perpetual victimhood, this is Marxism. In other words, dividing people is good for business if you're a Marxist. And so if you can't divide people economically, it's the workers.
Class,
now we're going to do it with these categories. So women, people of color, transgender. We're going to create these categories and we're going to divide people that way. And if you say, hey, I'm a Christian, I believe God loves everybody, that's not good for business. They want to stoke the fires of racism. They want to invent racism. We've seen this unbelievable proliferation of hoaxes of racist events that turn out to be created by people of color almost to draw attention to themselves. And you think, what a bizarre world we've entered. So I think people are kind of recognizing this, but you're giving us the historical background.
And I want to almost telescope out from that a moment to say, I believe there is a sort of a meta narrative going on here around creating this impression that things are just terrible everywhere. Now, let me caveat by saying bad things are happening all the time. They're real. There are victims. They should be recognized, taken care of. But something is going on, and you see it even in the economy. You see it even in the various climate crisis, looming apocalypse. All of this language is also Marxist. The Marxists have this idea of the immiseration thesis, right? Which is this idea that in order to bring in our utopia, we have to make sure people understand that things are bad, they're going to get worse, and they're going to continue to get worse until there's this cataclysm that flushes it all out, which of course was the Bolshevik Revolution as a type where basically impoverished the people, broke the currency, did all of these things. I mention it because I think if you look carefully enough, or at least actually back away and look from perspective, you see this sort of intentional immiseration, making things worse, making things bad.
Look, there's no doubt about it. And I think people need to hear this because many people are looking around and thinking, what is going on? It looks almost as though the Democrats are working overtime to destroy America. But why would they do that? They're just incompetent. You realize, no, they are working overtime to destroy the version of America they don't like, to fundamentally transform America. So they want to bring in millions of people through our southern borders to create that kind of chaos, to create that kind of financial pressure. They want to destroy this pipeline and that. They don't want us to be energy independent. They want these crises, they believe, will kind of bring us to our knees and lead to the socialist utopia where everybody will say, okay, we can't handle it, so government, just tell us what to do. We're going to a break. We continue the conversation with Michael Wilkerson, the book, an important book, Why America Matters. Folks, I'm talking with the author of a brand new book, an important book. I call it an astonishing achievement because I think it is. It is Why America Matters. So you take us through the history of America to help us understand where we are now. It's important that we understand this, and that's why I'm so grateful to you for writing this book. Obviously, you're not the only person trying to make sense of things, but you do so in a unique way. And let me ask you, Michael, how do you think your book is unique? In other words, because there are people writing books trying to make sense of where we are. What is it about your book that you think is different?
I think the perspective of really starting with what do we see going on around us in the last couple of years. I talk about 4 crises. The crisis of circumstances, all the things that are happening, pandemic, China. Secondly, the crisis of institutions. They don't trust us and we don't trust them. The crisis of identity, that Americans no longer know who we are. And finally, the crisis of engagement, which means that all 3 of those things conspire to limit America's ability to engage with itself and to engage with the world. We can't make good policies because we have a confused sense of what we're trying to accomplish. So number one, I think the perspective, what's different, the perspective that I come at it in time. Secondly, I really do try to move on from problem identification to what can we do to address this issue? How can America be restored? And I'm making a point that says we can't just go back to the past. This isn't about just a lament for traditional values. They're important, I affirm them, but I make a statement that says, let's take the example of foreign policy. America was very isolationist for its first 150 years. The wars of the 20th century made that position impossible forevermore. On the other hand, at the turn of the next millennium, what I call the book, The Millennial Churning, we took the opposite approach of interventionism everywhere. Endless wars, having to be everywhere at all times, forcing American values on people that may or may not have wanted them at enormous cost and consequence to our own nation and our identity.
Well, look, you cannot force self-government on people any more than you can force believing in Jesus on people. You can't. There's certain things that are by definition free. And so, that's kind of what happened under George Bush. And obviously it didn't go well.
Yeah, it didn't go well. Having said that, one of the links that I make in the book, right before the break, we were talking about what I called the ideological attack. What is happening inside of America and our confusion has been clearly identified as an opportunity by our adversaries. China in the lead, Russia, Iran, and others have noticed and are taking advantage of it, taking opportunity. We've seen it in terms of China's incursions, espionage, stealing of massive amounts of information and data. We see it in their influencing of the same social media, the same surveillance, the same issues that we've talked about in other aspects. This is something that, again, I think more so today Americans are aware of it, but even 2 years ago, I would suggest the vast majority of Americans had no idea the undermining of our economy, of our society, of our culture, our values that was being taking place surreptitiously. It's now coming to light, and Americans are starting to wake up.
Well, it
to
does
this.
seem to me that Trump was awake to much of this. In other words, he knew the game that China was playing. And I think that the reason he's been so attacked is because he did begin to go against that. And when you go against that, you're going against those in this country who have been appeasing China, which is to say many Republicans, most of the Democrats. It's good for business. Biden, I can't imagine that anyone today doesn't think that Biden is deeply corrupt, along with the Clintons, and was making millions and millions of dollars by not going there, by not confronting any of this stuff. So it seems to me part of the solution has to be to elect people that understand this, and there are just a handful of them.
You've hit on so many issues so quickly that I want to respond in a bunch of different ways, but let me just touch on a couple things that I also hit on in the book, which is the censorship of important issues that are going on. You mentioned the laptop, now infamously known as having a lot more than what was led onto at the time. The takedown of the social media platform Parler by a group of big tech companies that basically were going to take advantage of a moment in time around January 6th. January 6th, the treatment, no one, myself included, advocates or supports what happened on January 6th. The issue becomes the unequal application of justice. It becomes the illegitimate prosecution of people that were foolish, that were wrong, but aren't terrorists, aren't domestic terrorists.
Well, I mean, I think we don't even want to get into that conversation because, first of all, nobody even knows what happened on January 6th, which tells you everything you need to know. If you don't know what happened, the idea that people are all up in arms over what? Can somebody explain to me exactly what? And clearly, they're working hard not to explain what really happened, but trying to push forward this narrative, which, again, it's one of those things that you just think, this is unprecedented in America, that the governing classes would work with this kind of heavy hand to demonize half of the country. Anyway, we've got 30 seconds left. Please continue, and then we'll be back.
So, and I think what I would say there is that the attack has come in a way, when half of Americans are deemed domestic terrorists, we've reached the end of the road for reconciliation. So the question that I raise is, how in the world do we ever recover from a nation in which people are so polarized? This isn't 80% of people, 90% of people being controlled by a 10% elite. There is an element of that in the deep state. The problem is that we truly are divided. Call it 40-40, 20% who are people who don't know, don't care, who really are fundamentally opposed to each other and the ideas of America. That's a scary place to be. I suggest how we might get out of that stalemate in the book.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Final segment with Michael Wilkerson, the author of an extraordinary book, Why America Matters. It's like two books in one. Amazing reprise of American history, which then leads to where we are now and what we do to deal with where we are now. One of the things you touched on, one of the four, I don't know what you call them, crises.
Crisis of institutions, identity,
okay, the institutions. That is something that I didn't understand that. That's why I always say, like, I admit how dumb I was until 10 minutes ago. When I wrote my book, If You Can Keep It, it struck me that, wow, if we the people are the government, if we're self-governing, it means by definition we have to believe in the institutions because we are the institutions. There's no government up there governing me. I'm governing myself. So I have to trust the IRS. I have to trust the cops, the FBI. I have to trust that these organizations are just extensions of myself. We are self-governing. When that begins to break down, you get corruption. And of course, corruption, it's like the death spiral because now the government is corrupt, so I pull back. I don't vote. I don't get involved. It's us against them, whatever. And so in a sense, we need to restore the government to the American people. That to me is kind of at the heart of all of this. Now, how that's done is complicated, but that is a major crisis when you finally get to the point where you say, we are no longer being represented. I mean, you could argue that the 13 colonies finally got to that point with King George's government. They said, we now know that he is at odds with us. This is no longer imperfect. It's now broken.
Most of the debate, a lot of the debate that went on around the time of the Declaration, the Constitution, that founding era, was an acknowledgement that the biggest danger the new republic would face would be the consolidation of power behind a king, a monarch. That all of the checks and balances, the institutional framework, the three branches of government were set up in order to try to put in protections for that. We have entered into a dangerous phase where the tyranny that was feared by the founding fathers has manifested, not in an imperious monarch, But in the executive branch, all of these institutions, these three-letter organizations that have now usurped the control that rightly belongs to the citizens, acting through Congress, through their elected representatives, to make laws, and a judiciary that judges them. But those organizations now are disregarding Congress. They're not being held accountable. They're lying to Congress. There's multiple, and I cover some of them in my book, multiple instances of senior officials from these three-letter institutions blatantly lying to Congress and thus to the American people, or simply refusing not to show up and answer questions.
Look, the FBI, when they raid a pro-life pastor's home and come at him with like 30 agents, these are the redcoats, folks. It's pretty clear. They are no longer representatives of we the people. These are the redcoats. They're oppressive. Now, what we do about it, I don't know. But I think we need to be clear that something has gone so wrong that we have these kinds of things happening over and over again. And I think the good news is I think it is waking up your average American and saying, something's wrong. This is not America.
That's right. And so beyond just informing Americans about their own history in these events, one of the purposes of Why America Matters is exactly what you just said, to motivate Americans of all stripes and all walks of life to get off the couch, get off from behind the screen, and actually do something. We're seeing it right now because Americans are realizing what's going on. So increased activism in schools, school boards, all sorts of ways. The moment that we're in is challenging because the institutions are reacting. You described one of many examples of what appear to be weaponization of the Justice Department, of the FBI. There are many. The list is very long, and it's getting worse. And so something does have to be done. I go through some of that in the book as to what can be done. But simply put, one way or another, the power of the surveillance state, the power of the surveillance corporation society has to be broken, has to be modified, and Americans have to stand up. They have to stand up for their families, for their communities, for their local lives. And if they don't, my concern, my fear is that we are entering the point of about to hit the point of no return.
Yeah.
At some point, you can no longer stand up and resist.
Well, that has animated me, what you just said, for the last number of years. I've said we no longer have anything to lose. We have to fight. I cannot keep my powder dry for another day. The battle is now. But there are many people still thinking, well, not yet, not yet. And obviously in my new book, Letter to the American Church, I am horrified at Christian leaders who still, they kind of want to go back to where we were 5 or 10 years ago. They don't understand that the people in your pews are going through agony. They're looking for leadership. And it ought to be the church that has the courage, that has no excuse in terms of speaking out, as church leaders did during the Revolution, up to the Revolution, against the slave trade, people who kind of put two and two together. And that, to me, again, the reason it's horrifying is because we know what happens in Germany when the church was silent. There came a point, you just said it, where now if you figured it out, it's too late. You missed your window, shut up, you have nothing to say. And so if people don't fight now, it's over. So I don't remember exactly how you conclude your book, but I know that that's part of it.
It's part of it. And by the way, I have read your new book, Letter to the American Church. It is excellent. This is a great book that everyone should read if you haven't already, because it is a wake-up call. It is the Toscan sounding, the alarm bell that we need to hear as Americans.
The what? The
Toscan bell, the ringing of the bell.
Oh, right.
My book's longer, and that's the only problem with it. Is you got it done, and you got it in quite shortly.
They're different kinds of books, but listen, part of the good news is that the horrible crises through which we are living is leading people like you and me to write books and to shout, and it's leading people to take action and to understand where we are.
Yeah, and I do. We've talked about a lot of heavy things, and some of them can be discouraging. What I will say is writing this book left me with a great hope that just at the beginning, God does care about the future of America. He does have his hand on this nation. He loves it. The only nation in history that actually chose God as sort of a foundational idea. He chose the Israelites. We chose him. And even today, where goes America, so goes the world. And I take comfort and courage in knowing that our virtues of justice, equality, democracy, all the things that we stand for have a place in the world, and in fact are more needed today than ever. And so I take heart, and I want Americans to take heart as well.
The book is Why America Matters. The author, Michael Wilkerson. Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be with you.
Hey folks, Eric Metaxas here. Before taking Nutramedix, I looked and felt, well, like this. And now look at me. Nutramedix all-natural supplements enhance immunity, energy, overall health, and they might even cure baldness.
It doesn't cure baldness.
Whatever. The point is, if you want to feel great, go to Nutramedix.com and use the code ERIC for huge savings.